Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving into one of America's most haunting mysteries, a story of power, loyalty, and disappearance that still echoes through history. Some mysteries never fade. They echo through decades, haunting every attempt to find the truth. On a warm summer afternoon in July 1975, one of America's most powerful and controversial men vanished without a trace. His name was Jimmy Hoffa, a figure who once stood at the very heart of America's labor movement, feared by some, admired by others, and closely watched by both the government and the underworld. At exactly 2:00 p.m., Hoffa was seen waiting outside the Machus Red Fox restaurant in a quiet Detroit suburb. He had arranged to meet two men both known for their influence, both connected to organized circles. Hoffa stood there, in his trademark suit, looking impatient as minutes turned into hours. But that was the last confirmed moment anyone ever saw him alive. By evening, his car was found abandoned, and the man who once controlled one of the largest labor unions in the world was gone, as if he had been erased from existence. For nearly 5 decades, his disappearance has haunted America's imagination. What happened to Jimmy Hoffa? Did he walk into a trap that afternoon? Was his meeting part of a setup, or was this the price he paid for challenging the forces that once protected him? To understand why Hoffa's story became one of the greatest mysteries in American history, we have to step back in time to an era when power, money, and loyalty were bound by invisible lines. Hoffa rose from humble beginnings to lead the Teamsters Union, giving millions of working-class Americans a stronger voice. Yet behind that success, his growing alliance with organized crime figures blurred the line between legitimate labor power and the darker side of influence. By the 1970s, Hoffa's ambition to reclaim his throne after serving time in prison made him both a symbol of resilience and a potential threat. He wanted his old seat back, but the world he helped build had changed, and not everyone wanted him back in it. That fateful day, July was not supposed to end in mystery. Hoffa's friends expected him home for dinner. His wife waited for his call, but when night fell and there was no sign of him, it became clear that something extraordinary had happened, something planned, precise, and irreversible. The search began immediately. FBI agents, helicopters, dogs, and endless rumors. Over the years, investigators dug up fields, tore down buildings, and even examined football stadiums, all in the hope of finding a trace of the missing man. Yet every lead led to another dead end. Nearly half a century later, the name Jimmy Hoffa still carries the weight of an unsolved riddle, a story that blends power, betrayal, and silence. Because sometimes, the most powerful man in the room does not disappear by accident. It was July 30th, 1975. Just another bright afternoon in suburban Detroit, or so it seemed. At 2:00 p.m., Jimmy Hoffa pulled into the parking lot of the Machus Red Fox, a small but elegant restaurant on Telegraph Road in Bloomfield Township. He was there for a lunch meeting that, according to him, would help resolve an ongoing dispute between two powerful men from the union world, Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone from Detroit, and Anthony Tony Provenzano, a New Jersey Teamsters official with a history of both influence and intimidation. Witnesses remember Hoffa standing outside the restaurant's front door, checking his watch again and again. Dressed in a dark suit, despite the summer heat, he seemed restless, even annoyed. He told a friend earlier that morning that if the two men did not show up by 2 of the clock sharp, he would walk out. But when the clock struck 2:30 and then 3:00, Hoffa was still there. And after that, he was gone forever. Later that evening, his green Pontiac Granville was found in the same parking lot. The keys were still inside, but there was no trace of Hoffa, no struggle, no witnesses, no clues. It was as though the man had stepped off the face of the earth. When news broke that Jimmy Hoffa had disappeared, it sent shockwaves across the nation. This was not just any man. Hoffa had once controlled 1.5 million workers through the Teamsters Union, one of the largest and most politically powerful labor organizations in America. Presidents had feared him, senators had questioned him, and the Mafia had admired and later resented him. The FBI launched an immediate investigation, codenamed Operation Hoffa. Agents interviewed hundreds of people, searched vehicles, and followed countless leads. They even drained lakes and dug up backyards in the Detroit area. But every trail ended the same way, with more questions than answers. Some believed Hoffa had been lured into a car under the pretense of a meeting, driven to a remote location, and never seen again. Others thought he had been betrayed by someone he trusted, someone from within his own circle. The union world, once united by Hoffa's iron leadership, had become a web of rival factions, mob deals, and power struggles. In the weeks following his disappearance, newspapers filled their front pages with his photo, smiling, confident, a symbol of strength. Yet behind that image was a man who may have known too much, and who might have been silenced to keep those secrets buried. By the end of 1975, no ransom, no message, no body. Just silence and a growing legend. And so began one of America's longest-running mysteries. One that would stretch across decades and leave generations of investigators asking the same haunting question. What really happened to Jimmy Hoffa? Before he became a headline, Jimmy Hoffa was a man of grit, persistence, and unshakable ambition. Born in 1913 in Brazil, Indiana, Hoffa grew up in a working-class family that knew the struggles of the Great Depression firsthand. His father died when he was young, leaving the family to fend for themselves. That early hardship would shape Hoffa's personality: practical, fearless, and fiercely loyal to the working man. By his late teens, Hoffa was already involved in labor organizing. He began his career as a warehouse worker, where he witnessed unfair wages, brutal hours, and management intimidation. Unlike most who accepted their fate, Hoffa refused to stay silent. With a voice that carried both warmth and authority, he rallied his fellow workers to demand better treatment. This boldness caught attention, and not always the good kind. But for Hoffa, confrontation was never something to fear. It was a tool to achieve results. In the 1930s and 40s, as America's industries expanded, Hoffa climbed rapidly through the ranks of the Teamsters Union, a group that represented truck drivers and transport workers nationwide. The union was known for its toughness, but under Hoffa's influence, it became a force of unmatched power. He negotiated better pay, pensions, and protections, winning the loyalty of thousands who saw him as their champion. Yet power never comes without a price. Hoffa understood that influence required alliances, and some of those alliances came from the darker corners of society. The Teamsters' reach extended into industries controlled by organized crime, and soon lines between business and the underworld blurred. Still, Hoffa maintained one rule: as long as workers benefited, he did not care where the help came from. By the 1950s, Hoffa had transformed the Teamsters into the most powerful labor union in the United States, commanding millions of members and billions in pension funds. Politicians courted him, businessmen feared him, and the media could not look away. To many Americans, Hoffa symbolized the strength of the working class, a man who could stand toe-to-toe with corporate giants and win. But the same qualities that made him a hero to some made him an enemy to others. The U.S. government, led by Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, launched a series of investigations into Hoffa's ties to corruption and organized crime. He was accused of using union funds for illegal activities, fixing contracts, and trading favors with mob figures. Hoffa denied it all, calling it political persecution. Still, the pressure kept building. By the late 1960s, Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering and fraud, sending him to federal prison. Even behind bars, his influence lingered. His allies continued to operate, His enemies plotted his downfall, and his name remained a symbol of both power and controversy. When he was released in 1971, Hoffa had only one goal: to take back the throne he once held. But the world outside had changed, and that decision would set the stage for his disappearance just 4 years later. When Jimmy Hoffa walked out of prison in 1971, he was older, hardened, and determined to reclaim what he believed was rightfully the leadership of the Teamsters Union. But the world he had ruled with an iron hand had shifted dramatically in his absence. While Hoffa was serving time, Frank Fitzsimmons, once his trusted deputy, had taken over as president of the Teamsters. Under Fitzsimmons, the union softened its stance, building friendlier ties with both politicians and powerful business interests. More importantly, it grew even closer to organized crime syndicates, the same network that had once been both Hoffa's ally and protector. When Hoffa began talking about taking back control, those ties became a threat. The mob had moved on. They had new friends in high places, and they did not want Hoffa returning to upset the balance. Hoffa's old-school leadership, tough, outspoken, and unwilling to bow to anyone, was now seen as dangerous. Still, Hoffa did not back down. He began touring the country, visiting union halls, shaking hands, and promising workers that he would clean house and make the Teamsters strong again. His speeches drew crowds. His name still carried weight. But his comeback was not just about ambition, it was also personal. He wanted to prove he had not been broken by prison or politics. Behind the scenes, Hoffa tried to leverage his old connections, including figures in both labor and organized crime. But that world had changed too. Men who once owed him loyalty now saw him as a liability. He was too visible, too outspoken, and too unpredictable. In private meetings and phone calls, Hoffa made it clear he was planning to reveal what he knew about the Mafia's involvement in union affairs if that is what it took to get his power back. That decision, according to many investigators, may have sealed his fate. By 1975, tensions had reached a boiling point. Hoffa had publicly accused several high-ranking union figures of betrayal. He also hinted that he would expose their criminal connections in upcoming hearings. Friends warned him to stay quiet, to let it go. But Hoffa had never been the kind of man to stay silent, not when he felt betrayed. And so, when he received an invitation to meet with Tony Giacalone and Tony Provenzano in late July 1975, he believed it might be the first step toward negotiation, a chance to regain influence or at least settle old disputes. What he did not know was that this meeting would lead him directly into a trap from which he would never return. To this day, many believe Hoffa's disappearance was the result of a mob-sanctioned hit carried out to protect powerful interests within both the Union and the Mafia. He had become too loud, too proud, and too dangerous to keep alive. But in the end, Hoffa's greatest mistake was not trusting the wrong people. It was underestimating how much the world had changed while he was gone. When Jimmy Hoffa vanished on July 30th, 1975, the news spread across the nation like wildfire. Within hours, reporters crowded outside his suburban Detroit home. Cameras flashed, headlines screamed, and America was left asking the same question: how could one of the most powerful men in the country simply disappear in broad daylight? The FBI immediately launched what would become one of the largest and longest-running investigations in American history, known internally as Operation Hoffa. Agents were flown in from multiple states, and the Detroit field office turned into a command center buzzing with activity. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses, retraced Hoffa's last known movements, and checked every possible lead. The first clues seemed promising, but soon unraveled. Hoffa's green Pontiac Grandville was discovered, still parked at the Machus Red Fox restaurant. Keys inside, but there was no evidence of a struggle, no fingerprints. No fibers, nothing that suggested what had happened after 2:30 p.m. That eerie absence of clues only deepened the mystery. The FBI's working theory was clear. Hoffa had been lured into a car, likely under false pretenses, and taken to another location. From there, what happened remains speculation. Some believed he was killed that very afternoon. Others thought he might have been transported elsewhere for questioning or negotiation that went wrong. Investigators followed hundreds of tips, each one more dramatic than the last. A fisherman claimed to have seen something suspicious near Lake Michigan. A truck driver reported a strange package being loaded at a warehouse, and an anonymous caller said Hoffa's body had been buried beneath Giants Stadium in New Jersey. The FBI dug up fields, farms, and even the backyard of known mobsters, but each excavation turned up nothing. Over the next few months, dozens of informants came forward, hoping for immunity or attention, spinning tales of secret burials, concrete foundations, and industrial furnaces. Every story seemed possible, and everyone led to a dead end. Hoffa's family, meanwhile, held out hope. His wife, Josephine, refused to believe he was gone. His children pleaded for answers. But as weeks turned into months, the truth became harder to deny. Jimmy Hoffa was not coming back. By the end of 1975, the investigation had exhausted nearly every lead in Michigan. The FBI began to expand its focus to New Jersey, Florida, and Pennsylvania, tracing possible mob connections across state lines. Yet, despite all the resources, manpower, and attention, they were left with only a ghost, a man who had simply vanished into history. In December 1975, Hoffa was officially declared missing. Though the FBI never closed the case, for decades agents kept his file open, chasing every new rumor that surfaced, from hidden steel drums in landfills to crematorium confessions whispered by dying mobsters. But no matter how many times they searched, the ending was always the same: no body, no evidence, no closure. Jimmy Hoffa had become not just a missing person, but a legend of disappearance, a symbol of how even the most powerful man can simply vanish. As the years passed, the mystery surrounding Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance only grew darker, more tangled, and more mythic. Without a body, without a crime scene, and without a single witness brave enough to talk, the world was left with theories, hundreds of them, some born from fact, others from imagination. Yet, among them, a few stand out as chillingly possible. The most widely accepted theory is that Hoffa was killed by the Mafia, a decision sanctioned by top-level mob bosses who saw him as a threat. After his release from prison, Hoffa had become increasingly vocal about reclaiming control of the Teamsters Union, but that union, by 1975, had become heavily entwined with organized crime. Billions of dollars flowed through its pension funds, much of it loaned to mob-connected businesses and casinos. Hoffa's return risked exposing years of secret deals. Investigators believe the meeting at the Machus Red Fox was a trap carefully planned by men Hoffa once trusted. The names Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano and Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone appear again and again in FBI files. Both were seasoned power players. Provenzano, a volatile New Jersey mobster and former Union ally who had turned against Hoffa; Giacalone, a respected Detroit figure known for organizing peace meetings that never ended peacefully. According to informants, Hoffa was picked up outside the restaurant and driven to a nearby location, possibly a private home in the Detroit area. There, the confrontation turned fatal. One account suggests Hoffa was struck in the head and his body later cremated in a mob-controlled funeral home. Another claims he was taken to a meat processing plant, dismembered, and destroyed in an industrial furnace. Over the decades, the FBI has followed dozens of alleged burial sites, from farms in Michigan to the swamps of Florida, even under Giants Stadium in New Jersey. None ever produced results. Each new generation of investigators dug up new theories, but the truth stayed buried if it was ever recorded at all. Some insiders later hinted that Hoffa's murder was ordered not just to silence him, but to send a message, a warning that no one, not even the most powerful labor boss in America could defy the structure that protected him for years. Others, however, believe Hoffa's fate might have been more complicated, that perhaps he tried to negotiate his way back in, only to realize too late that he was surrounded by men who had already decided his destiny. Even decades later, the FBI has never officially charged anyone, though the list of suspects remains long and notorious. In 1982, after 7 years without answers, Hoffa was declared legally dead. Yet for many Americans, that legal closure meant nothing. The question remained not just who killed Jimmy Hoffa, but why the truth has never surfaced. Because in the underworld of power, money, and silence, some secrets are too dangerous to ever be told. Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance did more than spark a criminal mystery. It shook the foundation of America's labor movement. For decades, Hoffa had been the face of the working class, strong, unyielding, and unafraid to confront power. He stood for the belief that an ordinary worker could rise to command respect from both corporate giants and political elites. But when he vanished, that belief began to crumble. After 1975, the Teamsters Union changed permanently. Under Frank Fitzsimmons and later leaders, the union softened its aggressive stance, becoming more bureaucratic and less revolutionary. The fearsome reputation that Hoffa had built, the one that made politicians tremble and business owners negotiate, began to fade. Without his iron will, the Teamsters entered an era of internal conflict and corruption scandals that would plague them for decades. For workers across America, Hoffa's disappearance was a symbolic loss. He had embodied the voice of millions who felt forgotten by the system, the men and women who drove the trucks, built the roads, and kept the country running. His downfall reminded them that power, even when built from the ground up, could vanish overnight when it clashed with the forces that truly ruled behind the scenes. Yet, even as his physical presence disappeared, Jimmy Hoffa, the legend, refused to die. His story became part of American folklore, retold in books, documentaries, songs, and Hollywood films. He became a mythic figure, half hero, half villain, forever trapped between admiration and infamy. In movies like Hoffa 1992, starring Jack Nicholson, and later The Irishman 2019, directed by Martin Scorsese, his story was reimagined as a Shakespearean tragedy, the rise and fall of a man consumed by ambition, loyalty, and betrayal. His name became shorthand for corruption and mystery. People would joke about hidden bodies being buried next to Jimmy Hoffa, but behind that humor was a real unease. The knowledge that one of the nation's most visible men could disappear and no one could prove how or why. In a broader sense, Hoffa's story also mirrored a turning point in American history, the moment when idealism gave way to cynicism. The 1970s were a decade of lost trust, political scandals, organized crime revelations, and disillusionment with authority. Hoffa's disappearance fit perfectly into that pattern, feeding a growing belief that real justice often lay beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. To his supporters, Hoffa remains a martyr of the working class, a man who dared to stand up to powerful systems and paid the ultimate price. To his critics, he was a ruthless power broker who blurred every moral line in pursuit of control. But in the end, perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, because Jimmy Hoffa was both a product of his time and a reflection of America itself, ambitious, flawed, relentless, and unforgettable. As the decades rolled on, Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance refused to fade into history. Instead, it became a living mystery, one that seemed to resurrect itself every few years, with new tips, new suspects, and new promises of closure. For the FBI, the case became an obsession. For journalists, it was a story that never stopped selling. And for the public, it was the ultimate riddle of power and betrayal. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, a stream of confessions began surfacing, each one claiming to finally reveal what had happened to Hoffa. Some came from former mobsters seeking redemption, others from prison inmates chasing attention. A few seemed credible, at least at first. One of the most famous claims came from Charles "Chucky" O'Brien, Hoffa's longtime aide and almost like an adopted son. Investigators suspected that O'Brien might have been the one to drive Hoffa to his death, using a borrowed car that matched witness descriptions. But despite years of scrutiny, no definitive proof ever tied him to the crime. Another lead came from Frank Sheeran, a Philadelphia mob hitman who claimed in his later years that he was the one ordered to kill Hoffa. His story, detailed in the book I Heard You Paint Houses and dramatized in Scorsese's film The Irishman, described Hoffa being shot inside a Detroit house and cremated nearby. The confession drew attention worldwide, but again, the FBI found no physical evidence to support it. Over the years, law enforcement has searched an astonishing array of locations, farms, warehouses, junkyards, and even backyards. In 2006, agents dug up land near Detroit based on a new tip, but the ground revealed nothing. In 2012, investigators went to a Roseville driveway, prompted by an old mob rumor. They drilled through concrete, finding only debris. Even as recently as 2021, the FBI reopened the case after a dying landfill worker claimed Hoffa was buried beneath a New Jersey landfill once controlled by organized crime. Agents searched the site for weeks, using radar, excavators, and forensic scanners. But once again, they came up empty-handed. The case had become not just an investigation, but a national obsession. A story that combined politics, crime, and mythology. Reporters joked that every time you dig up dirt in America, you find another theory about Jimmy Hoffa. Yet the persistence of those theories spoke to something deeper, a cultural need to understand how a man so visible, so feared, and so famous could disappear without leaving even a trace. By the 2000s, most of Hoffa's contemporaries were gone. Those who might have known the truth had either died or taken their secrets with them. But the FBI still kept the case open, a rare acknowledgement that some mysteries, even half a century old, refuse to die. Jimmy Hoffa, in a sense, became immortal through mystery. His body may never have been found, but his story continues to haunt America, a reminder that truth can vanish as completely as the man himself did on that summer afternoon in 1975. After nearly half a century of investigations, documentaries, and confessions, one fact remains unchanged. No one has ever been charged with the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. Despite hundreds of interviews, decades of research, and dozens of excavations, the mystery remains one of the most frustrating puzzles in FBI history. Yet among the noise and rumors, a few theories stand above the rest, theories that, while never proven, align most closely with the evidence that does exist. The most widely accepted explanation is that Hoffa was murdered by order of the Mafia, specifically by figures connected to the Detroit and New Jersey crime families. According to investigators, Hoffa's attempt to reclaim the Teamsters presidency after prison was seen as a direct threat to the mob's financial control over the union's massive pension fund, a fund worth billions of dollars. If Hoffa had regained power, he could have exposed their operations or cut off their access to that money. That alone, many experts believe, was reason enough for the mob to eliminate him. FBI documents released over the years suggest that Hoffa's meeting at the Machus Red Fox was indeed a setup orchestrated by his former allies Anthony Provenzano and Anthony Giacolone. Hoffa had trusted these men, once considering them brothers in arms, but by 1975 both had turned against him. The supposed peace meeting was likely nothing more than bait. From there, the theories diverge, but the most credible scenario points to Hoffa being killed shortly after being abducted, likely within an hour of leaving the restaurant. Some believe he was taken to a safe house in northwest Detroit, where he was shot and later cremated at a mob-owned facility, leaving behind no remains to discover. Another long-standing theory places Hoffa's body in an industrial steel drum, later transported to a waste site or incinerator in Detroit or New Jersey. Forensic experts note that if Hoffa's body had been disposed of in this way, the evidence would have been destroyed beyond recovery within hours, explaining why no physical trace has ever been found. Why, after so many decades, has no one come forward with definitive proof? The answer lies in fear and loyalty. The men involved in Hoffa's disappearance were not small players. They were part of an empire built on silence. Anyone who might have known the full story either died within the next decade or kept quiet to the end. Even deathbed confessions were vague, lacking specifics that could lead investigators to real evidence. Modern investigators now admit that the truth may never be fully known. Too much time has passed. Witnesses are gone. Records have been lost. And if Hoffa's body was indeed destroyed, not buried, but erased, then his case stands as the ultimate vanishing act. What remains is not the corpse, but a legend, a ghostly figure representing the intersection of ambition, corruption, and betrayal in America's post-war history. Because sometimes, the most powerful truths are buried not in the ground, but in the silence of those who swore never to speak. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa was more than a criminal mystery. It was a mirror reflecting America's complicated relationship with power, loyalty, and corruption. His vanishing act in 1975 marked not just the end of a man, but the closing chapter of an era when unions, politics, and organized crime all intersected behind the scenes of American prosperity. For decades, Hoffa had been a symbol of working-class power, a man who rose from the factory floor to command the respect of presidents and mob bosses alike. He fought fiercely for better wages and benefits, but he also wielded power with an iron fist, blurring the line between leadership and control. In Hoffa, America saw both the promise and the peril of ambition. When he disappeared, it was not only the man who vanished, it was also the illusion that power could be both pure and absolute. Hoffa's fate became a warning, a reminder that when influence grows too strong and too personal, it attracts forces determined to destroy it. In the decades that followed, his story came to represent a moral crossroads for the nation. To the working class, Hoffa remained a hero, a man who spoke their language, understood their struggles, and refused to bow to the wealthy elite. To others, he embodied everything that had gone wrong with the labor movement, the corruption, the greed, and the shadowy deals that turned noble causes into criminal enterprises. His disappearance seemed almost poetic, a man consumed by power, ultimately swallowed by the very darkness he once controlled. It symbolized how easily people can become victims of their own systems, trapped in a web they helped create. In the years after his death, Hoffa's myth grew larger than his life. Writers, filmmakers, and historians transformed him into a cultural archetype, the ambitious leader who flew too close to the sun. His name became shorthand for unresolved secrets and hidden truths. Even today, when Americans talk about something being buried like Hoffa, they are not just referring to a body, they are talking about the way truth itself can vanish under layers of power and silence. The deeper meaning behind his disappearance lies in what it says about the American dream. Hoffa's rise from poverty to influence was proof that hard work and determination could change a man's destiny. But his fall revealed the darker reality that the climb to power often comes at a cost, and the higher one ascends, the fewer friends remain when the storm comes. In the end, Jimmy Hoffa became both legend and lesson, a man who built empires and enemies in equal measure. His story endures not because of how he lived or died, but because it forces us to ask timeless questions. How far will a person go to gain power? And what happens when the forces that help you rise decide it is time for you to fall? Nearly 50 years after his disappearance, Jimmy Hoffa remains one of the most recognizable names in American history, not because of what was found, but because of what was not. His story continues to echo through generations, reminding America that even in an age of cameras, headlines, and power, truth can still vanish in the shadows. The cultural fascination with Hoffa never faded. It only evolved. In the decades after 1975, his name became a symbol of mystery, corruption, and consequence. He was the subject of countless documentaries, novels, and films, each offering a different theory, a new angle, or a moral interpretation. Hollywood turned him into an almost mythic figure, larger than life, impossible to define, and forever lost between hero and villain. In Danny DeVito's film, Hoffa 1992, Jack Nicholson portrayed him as a passionate but flawed man, a warrior for the working class, undone by his own alliances. Decades later, Martin Scorsese's The Irishman 2019 reignited public fascination, presenting Hoffa through the weary eyes of mob hitman Frank Sheeran, a man claiming to have pulled the trigger. Both films treated Hoffa not simply as a victim, but as a reflection of America itself, proud, ambitious, corruptible, and endlessly searching for meaning. But Hoffa's impact goes beyond cinema. His story reshaped how Americans view leadership, loyalty, and justice. For journalists, the Hoffa case became a blueprint for investigative persistence, a reminder that some stories never truly close. For the labor movement, his name remains a reminder of both its greatest triumphs and its darkest compromises, and for the general public, Hoffa became the symbol of the man who knew too much, a cautionary tale about what happens when ambition crosses the invisible line of control. The phrase "Where's Jimmy Hoffa" entered American slang, representing not just an unsolved crime, but any mystery too deep to answer. Even decades later, references appear everywhere in comedies, detective series, and political satire, proving how deeply his name has been carved into American consciousness. Yet there is something deeper behind the fascination. Hoffa's story captures the eternal American paradox, the struggle between idealism and corruption, between the dream of power and the cost of holding it. He stood for the idea that one man could challenge an entire system, but he also revealed how that system can destroy even its strongest players when they become inconvenient. Today, Hoffa's life and disappearance still inspire new generations of storytellers, historians, and truth-seekers. Each retelling brings new speculation, new discoveries, and new reflections on how power truly works in America. Because Jimmy Hoffa's story is not just about one man's disappearance. It is about a country's obsession with secrets, the blurred lines between justice and control, and the haunting realization that some truths may be too dangerous to uncover. In that sense, Hoffa never really vanished. He simply became part of America's soul, a name whispered whenever power, ambition, and silence collide. Almost 50 years have passed since Jimmy Hoffa walked out of that restaurant parking lot and disappeared forever. His story remains suspended in time, neither solved nor forgotten, a haunting reminder of how even the most powerful figures can vanish without a trace. But perhaps the real meaning of Hoffa's story lies not in where he ended, but in what he represented. Hoffa's rise from a poor boy in Indiana to the leader of one of the largest labor unions in the world was a testament to determination and vision. He was a man who understood both the strength and vulnerability of ordinary workers, people who built the nation but often had no voice in shaping it. Through courage, charisma, and relentless drive, Hoffa gave that voice power. He made the system listen, even when it did not want to. Yet his story also reveals the dangerous side of ambition, how easily influence can become corruption, and how loyalty can turn to betrayal when power is at stake. Hoffa fought for control until his final day, but he underestimated how deep the shadows ran around him. Those he trusted most may have been the ones who decided his fate. In the end, it was not a rival that destroyed him, it was the empire he helped build. His disappearance left a wound on American history that has never fully healed. It showed that justice can be elusive, even when the whole world is watching. It reminded us that truth is not always found in files or evidence, but sometimes buried in silence, protected by fear, and carried to the grave. But Hoffa's legacy is not only tragedy, it is also endurance. The fact that people still speak his name, still write, film, and debate his story, proves that he left behind something more powerful than a body. He left behind a symbol A man whose flaws and virtues were so intertwined that his life became a lesson about human nature itself. For some, Hoffa will always be the hero of the working class, the man who dared to take on the system and nearly won. For others, he will forever be the ruthless dealmaker whose own ambition consumed him. But for everyone, his story remains a mirror. It forces us to ask what power truly means and what price we are willing to pay to keep it. And so, half a century later, the question remains, what really happened to Jimmy Hoffa? Maybe one day the truth will surface. Or maybe it is already buried so deep that no one will ever find it. Until then, his story stands as one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries, part history, part legend, and part warning. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life and disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa, a man whose shadow still stretches across time. Don't forget to follow for more true stories where history and mystery collide. Because in the end, some names never fade, and Jimmy Hoffa is one of them. And that brings us to the end of today's story. The life, power, and disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa, a man who rose from the dust of the working class to become one of the most influential figures in American labor history, only to vanish under circumstances so mysterious that his name became a legend whispered through generations. Nearly 50 years later, the mystery still lingers. No body, no weapon, no confession that truly fits, only questions, rumors, and the haunting silence of time. But perhaps that is what keeps Hoffa's story alive. Not the answers we never found, but the mirror it holds up to us all. It reminds us that power can build empires, but it can also destroy the very people who hold it. That even those who seem untouchable can be brought down by greed, betrayal, or ambition. And maybe, in the quiet spaces between fact and speculation, Jimmy Hoffa has achieved something greater than survival immortality through mystery. Because every time someone asks, what really happened to Hoffa, his story lives on. So as we close today's chapter, remember this. History is not just about what we know, it is about what we keep searching for. The truth may be buried, but the questions will always remain. Thank you everyone for watching and staying with me through this journey into one of America's deepest unsolved mysteries. If you enjoyed the story and want more like it tales where power, truth, and darkness collide, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, take care, stay curious. And remember, some stories never end.